for doing that. So now I want to talk to you about this text. It's a very interesting text. To get to that, this is something I just want you to consider. This is sort of an ongoing thing I hope that you're doing intuitively. But I hope that you're keeping an open mind to what God might be doing in this space. You might not even think God is, and that's fine. But if you think there might be more to the story than flesh and blood and stuff going on, then at least entertain the possibility that as you're listening to me, that maybe there's more than me at work here. And if you sense some things coming up in your consciousness or reminding you of things that may be important, then I'm asking you to pay attention to those things and be asking yourself, what might be sticking with me today? What do I need to hear as we take a look at this text in greater depth? Because there's a lot here, and this is a disturbing text. If there weren't things that bothered you in this, something's wrong with you, because it's a disturbing text, and I want to talk about some of those things that are disturbing. So today I'm talking about seeing. How do we see? And how does that vision process of seeing affect things? And first, just a quick disclaimer. You basically trust me, right? Okay. Good. Because I probably either early on or later on in my talk, I'll probably offend everybody. So that's not really my goal, but probably a likelihood. And so just sit with me, okay? And trust me that I'm going to bring it home one way or another and make it come together, okay? Anybody a little nervous now? Okay, good.
Are you?
Am I nervous? No, not really. I stopped being nervous long ago. So I had a meeting this week in Stockton. June is a busy month for what our region is doing. We're part of a region of churches that are all over Northern California, and I'm in charge of clusters for our region. And in June, I try to make it to as many of those clusters as I can as we're launching a new book that we're going to read together over the coming year and all this, and check in with who our leader is there and all that stuff. So I had two this week, one in Stockton, one in San Francisco. And in Stockton, one of my pastor friends told me this story. And it starts like this, or the part that I'm going to give you starts like this. So they live out in the countryside, somewhere in Central Valley, outside of Stockton, California. And it had just gotten past dusk. It started to get dark. And they were planning to put their kids to bed as they usually do. And out in the countryside, if you've ever lived out in the country, you realize that nobody comes out there unless they have to come out there. You wouldn't go there. It's not like it's right off the interstate or anything like that. You'd have to make a decision to go out in the country to their house if you're going to do it. And so they were done for the night with no expectation of company. And then they saw the high beams turn onto their long drive. And a big SUV was roaring down their lane. And it stopped at their fence. And out of this SUV, in the dark, were 6 black men in hoodies. And they immediately jumped the fence and started running toward the house. This pastor's wife was freaking out. She could see this thing playing out. And she's yelling from upstairs. There are 6 black guys climbing over our fence in hoodies on their way to the house. And she yells it 3 times as loud as she can because she's freaking out. Now, this pastor had gotten a tip that one of these guys had just been released from prison. And he'd been there for several years. And they weren't sure exactly what would go down, but they knew that there was at least some likelihood that they were going to encounter each other in the future. They did not think it was going to be that night, and they did not think that he was going to bring friends. They come up to the door, they pound on the front door, and the door opens. And the one standing there who opened the door was a little boy. Pretty good story, isn't it? Wonder how it ends. I want to talk to you about Hagar. Hagar had it coming. She had it coming. You know the story. So Sarah and Abraham, somehow God told Abraham good things were coming. You just got to trust me. You're going to build a new relationship with humanity through what I'm going to do with you. It's going to be a game changer. Everybody has the rules and regulations, all this, but my covenant with you is one that's all about relationship and grace and dignity. And we're done with all the crazy number of sacrifices. We're going to go a new direction, and it's going to be good. And I'm going to give you so many kids, they're going to outnumber the stars in the heavens, the sand on the shore. And so Abraham and Sarah leave the comfort and wealth of his family, and they start off in their new direction, and they settle, and there's all kinds of other things that happen, but here they are. Now they're aging, and we caught up with the story last week, where now they're old, they're way into their senior years, and no baby. And so Sarah looks at Abraham and says, well, okay, maybe we got it wrong. So maybe what we need to do is kind of go the old-fashioned way, and we all know how the culture works here. So I've got this maidservant, quote-unquote slave, from Egypt. Her name is Hagar. She's been tending to me for a while. She's in the right age. Why don't you take her, sleep with her, make her your wife, and maybe God is going to give us our children through her. And so Abraham's like, okay, let's try that. And so she gets pregnant. We don't know how long after they got together, but she gets pregnant. And no miraculous way whatsoever. This is just old-fashioned, business. So she's pregnant. And she has the baby. Actually, before she even has the baby, once she's pregnant, she starts, my guess, is she starts having a little bit of attitude towards Sarah. And Sarah does not like her tone. Hagar had it coming. And so Sarah treated her so bad, put her in her place, held her accountable. And Hagar felt so bad, she walked away, just into the desert. Would rather die than have to be around Sarah. But come on, be honest. Hagar had it coming. Where did she come off? Spouting off to her master like that. It's her fault. She deserved the treatment that she got. So, not a surprise when we catch up to today's text that after a period of time, and there are two different authors that are writing in the book of Genesis, the Elohim writer and the Yahwist writer, and so there's some conflicting data about how old exactly was Ishmael at this time. Was he just a little tyke, or was he a teenager? Not quite sure, but here's what we do know. That when it came time to celebrate the arrival of Isaac, Sarah was looking very carefully at Abraham and Ishmael. And she's been thinking about this already. Now that she has this baby, she's thinking to herself, how's this going to play out? Ishmael's way older, his first son. Things are supposed to come through Isaac. We probably shouldn't have had that thing happen in the first place, but here we are. How are we going to work this thing out? She's thinking into the future. She knows that something is going to go down at some point. And it's going to be some kind of a standoff between Ishmael and Isaac. And Ishmael's got the upper hand because he's older. And he's already the oldest son. So she's worried about that. So she reads into a situation. Probably because Hagar had a history of not behaving well toward her. And so she sees Abraham and Ishmael laughing and just assumes, well, yeah, this is just the beginning. My kid, my son, he's toast. It's just a matter of time. This is going to be a Cain and Abel thing all over again. And my kid's going to die. And I can't have that. So, what does she do? She commands Abraham to kick them out. We don't want them in the household anymore. So get rid of them. And Hagar, if she'd just been nicer, if she'd been more respectful from the get-go, if she would have appreciated what she had all those years and not lipped off to Sarah, things would have been different. If Hagar just would have grown some grace in her life and been grateful for what she had, because now she was in this household, if she would have lived that way all those years, Sarah probably wouldn't have gone off like that. Hagar had it coming. This is just the way that Sarah could see things. And Abraham, when he heard what was going on, as the text indicates, he's not happy about this. This is his son. But what are you going to do? Happy wife, happy life. So we can't go forward like this. So sorry, Hagar. Cut me loose. Ishmael, it's been great, but it's just the way it goes. Probably shouldn't have had you in the first place. Now I'm kind of regretting that I did, because this is so hard. When Abraham sends them off, he packs everything that he gives them on Hagar's back. How much is that, would you guess? Not much. Sending her off into a desert wilderness. Not much. She's not going to make it very long. But Hagar had it coming. If only she'd had a better attitude early on, things would have been different for sure. Stupid slave. Stupid, disrespectful slave. Why couldn't she have done it differently or better? So, the boy who answered the door, a little more clarification, was black. My pastor friend is white. He's on staff at First Baptist Church of Stockton. And in their church, they are really big on helping children who are in a jam, and they do a lot with foster care and help all over the world with kids. They have a passion kind of like ours in that regard. And so in his ministry, his heart for wanting to help kids and fostering and all this kind of stuff was pretty well known. And a woman approached him after service one day who knew him and trusted him. She was a black woman, and she approached him and said, I need help. I need you to take my son because I'm a mess, and I need to get the help that I need, and I trust you. Will you take my son? And it was a big ask because he already had a boatload of kids. And so this is going to be one more mouth to feed, but he was like, well, am I a man of my word? Am I true to this thing or what? And so they said, yeah. And so they have this child. And everything they heard from the mother at this point was dad was in jail because he'd beat some people up, and it was almost an attempted murder kind of scenario, and she was a part of that, and he was no good, his family was no good. And so so all they had to do was hold on to this child until she got the help she needed, healed up, and then they could reunite. But dad got out early, and she called him and let him know that he's probably coming to see you. That's who showed up that night, this kid's father. Because you know what that guy had heard? He'd heard that some white guy out in the countryside had his son, and he wasn't going to have none of it. And so he was racing there to take his kid back. And if he was going to run into trouble, I better bring some friends to make sure this thing plays out right. So he pounds on the door, opens the door to his own son. Now the good news is, the story ends well. Ends really well. At that moment, nobody got beat up. There was certainly a lot of tension in the air. A lot going on under the surface. Mom, dad having conversation with these guys who are there. In his mind, for a very good reason. And they cleared up a lot of misinformation. And in time, this little boy was reunited with his dad and the dad's family, because it turned out that that was actually the healthiest environment for the child. It wasn't quite what he'd heard. Now, Hagar's story, this is where I'm going to turn the tide a little bit. It is normal for people who are on the top of the food chain, on the top of the rungs of power. It is normal for them to blame the victims of their problems. We naturally, because we want to look at the Bible, we want to look at the story, and we want to hold on to that, we want to celebrate our heroes in there. We look at Sarah and Abraham and their pillars of faith. They started the whole thing, and so we naturally want to protect them and say, Hey, they obviously did it right because God was still with them, still blessed them. So what we see them do must have been okay with God. I'm here to tell you, they blew it. They may have been ones that were chosen by God, but the decision that Sarah had in the first place to bring Hagar into the picture was a mistake that later the Apostle Paul would talk about many centuries later to the Galatian church, saying, you're trying to take this thing into your own hands when it was clearly told to you that this was going to be a God thing that was going to happen, and you blew that. And then once she's pregnant, would Hagar have attitude about that? Of course. Did Hagar want to be there at all? Hagar was a slave. Was that her childhood dream? This is what I want for my life? No. To even ask, why don't you just be grateful for what you have, a roof over your head, food on the table? That's a ridiculous thing to ask. This woman's life is not her own. And now she's been thrust into the bed of a much older guy that she wants nothing to do with. And she has no choice. And she gets pregnant. Great. Now she's stuck with it. And while there may be a part of her that you might see as, oh, well, hey, no, well, now she's a wife. She's got real rights and privileges. You really think so? You really think there's any equality in that house? No way, man. No way. So if she has a little bit of upset by the fact that she's pregnant, and that ticks off Sarah, Sarah had no right to come down on her the way she did. And when it was Isaac's time for his day, did something need to happen? Was something going to happen in the future? Absolutely needed to happen. There needed to be clarification on where this whole thing is going. But Sarah was out of line. She went too far. And so did Abraham. Something's going on underneath the surface that you and I might not be aware of. Is when Abraham sent her out, making her no longer a slave, he did something that was part of the cultural law at that time. He didn't just give her her freedom. He gave her absolutely nothing. Because once he released her as a slave, she no longer, her son, Ishmael, no longer had inheritance rights. So you send her out with a little canteen of water. She's got a son. Nobody's going to believe her story about what is happening to you. Hagar's a victim. Hagar's a victim. We have no right to cast judgment on her for what she's going through. And we have every right to look at Abraham and Sarah and say, what are you thinking? So for this story, a lot of people who've been victimized in one way or another resonate a lot with Hagar because there's something amazing that happens here. There's a quote that I want to share with you by a woman named Phyllis Tribal. There it is. Most especially, she's a biblical scholar. She was kind of came on the scene in 1972 as this major biblical scholastic voice. Was a key part of major biblical translation issues in the 1980s, and this is what she wrote. Most especially, all sorts of rejected women find their stories in her. She is the faithful maid exploited, the black woman used by the male and abused by the female of the ruling class, the surrogate mother, the resident alien without legal recourse, the other woman, the runaway youth, the religious fleeing from affliction, the pregnant young woman alone, the expelled wife, the divorced mother with child, the shopping bag lady carrying bread and water, the homeless woman, the indigent relying upon handouts from the power structures, the welfare mother, and the self-effacing female whose own identity shrinks in service to others. A lot of people resonate with this difficult story because they see themselves in Hagar. And they understand what it's like to be victimized. They understand to have cards given you that you did not want to play, and yet you had to. They understand what it means to be judged inappropriately, not by the same standards. They know what power plays are, and they know that they are being played. And they know they have very little recourse to do much about it. They are stuck. And the reason why they like this story so much is something that you and I might not see so quickly. Because if you're a Jewish reader, in antiquity reading this story, you'd be all over it. You'd be just fine with it. Because Abraham and Sarah are your people. And you're like, well, of course this is going to happen. Who cares about Hagar and Ishmael? We all know what happened to those people. They became tyrants wandering all over the Middle East, causing problems wherever they went. To this day, this is kind of what you're thinking. Even in antiquity, you're thinking, oh, those people, the line of Ishmael, they're crazy folks. Don't trust them anywhere. Terrorists, for sure. That's what we say then. That's what we say now. If you're Jewish, however, or Christian, you're like, no big deal. God did it right. Cut it off soon. A lot easier to get through it. And so we're fine if we're on that side of the equation, and the side of power where Abraham and Sarah are heroes. We're fine seeing these two go out into the wilderness. But what surprises us is this, is that when Hagar leaves Ishmael because she can't stand to see him suffer, and he cries, a crazy, unexpected thing happens. God shows up to Hagar because he loves Hagar and he loves Ishmael. This is a shock. Do you understand me? This is a shock. If you're Jewish, this is the enemy camp, and God is showing up to them and saying, I want you to have hope. All is not lost. I see what's going on here. I'm going to take care of you. It's going to be all right. You just got to trust me on this. And if you read later on into Genesis, Ishmael ended up getting married, ending up having 12 sons of his own. That's a great sign of success for his future. And so we know that going forward, that God shows grace to Ishmael and Hagar. And then an amazing thing happens. I don't think this is a miracle, by the way. I think when we see that God opens Hagar's eyes and there's a well of water, here's what has been my experience. In fact, if you watched The Shack or read the book The Shack, there's a great line about this, that when we are so consumed by our pain and the struggle that we're going through, we cannot see clearly. We can't see the thing. We can't even see the nose in front of our face. I think the water was there all along. I just think Hagar was so distraught she did not have eyes to see. And God enabled her seeing the water, seeing her value, seeing God's grace, seeing her future, even though the other people in the story had trouble seeing her the same way. It's a story about seeing. And for you Hagars out there, I'm wondering how you see yourself. I'm wondering if you resonate with Hagar and her experience. And you might not be a woman. You could be a person with darker skin tones than mine, and that would put you potentially in Hagar's camp. You could just be a woman. In our culture, even still, that qualifies. But hear this. There's a different kind of identity that God is speaking into you. That while everybody around you may be saying one thing, what God does here with Hagar, God still does for you. I am with you. I love you. I support you. Let's move forward together. I won't let you go. I'm here with you. For those of us that are more on the Abraham and Sarah side, who maybe would have done the same thing, maybe some of us today in our culture, we look down at our noses on the Hagars of our world. People on this list that Phyllis Tribal talked about. People that shouldn't whine so much. People of color, Black Lives Matter, we scoff. I'm like, what are you kidding me? Slavery ended 160 years ago. What's your problem? Get over it. And the civil rights movement, we think, that's done. You're equal under the law, so get over it. Or we think about all Muslims everywhere. And we think the whole lot of them, oh, you're Ishmael's tribe. We can never trust people who look like you from that part of the world. It can't happen. Illegal in this country? Climbed over the wall, did you? Why should we give you any respect whatsoever? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because God does. God does. Leander Keck, who is a renowned biblical scholar, I think he's passed on now, he wrote this, which is difficult for us fans of Sarah and Abraham to read. It says the text does affirm that God chooses the line of Isaac. That was the plan all along, not that of Ishmael. This is a strong claim, and it occasions a sharper question for Isaac's descendants than if the treatment had been more even-handed. What one does with the Ishmaels of this world in the face of the claims for Isaac comes front and center. Abraham was chosen so that all families might be blessed through him. This means that the children of Abraham, who are also the children of Isaac, are so to comport, in other words, that is, conduct themselves. That blessing, rather than curse, comes upon the nation. Let me read that a little bit again. This means that the children of Abraham, who are also the children of Isaac, are so to comport themselves that blessing, rather than curse, comes upon the nations. So this story is a challenge, because it challenges us to wonder about our own eyes and how well do we see. And if you look more like me than you do like perhaps Hagar, if you're not asking that question, there is a really good chance you're blind and you don't even know it. You're just as blind as Hagar, not seeing the water right at the end of her nose. We, as the people of God, who claim to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, who claim to follow in the same spirit of Christ that we see at work with Abraham back in that day, we are called to be graceful. We are called to come alongside. We are called to see people with dignity and respect, because that's how God sees them. And I'm wondering how this messes with you. My pastor friend in Stockton, a learned guy. You don't get to be a pastor of our denomination's church unless you've at least had a master's degree. A lot of education. This guy is no dummy. He's been exposed to a whole lot in his world, but I'll tell you this. He had no idea just how strong racial prejudice is until he was walking around with his foster son. His white hand in a black hand, walking through the stores in Lodi. And the looks he got, and the head shaking, and the murmuring, opened his eyes in ways that he didn't know to see and didn't want to see. Who are you today? Hagar? There's good news for you. God has got to see you. For you to see yourself differently with dignity and worth and value. Not based on what the culture says, but rooted in what God whispers in your ear and shouts from the mountaintops and communicates right out of the pages of Scripture. Are you more the Abraham and Sarah? Well, this is good news for you too. Because you don't have to act like that. You can be with God. You can have your vision restored too, that you might act in ways that reflect Christ. Let's pray together, and I'm going to make you think. So God, as we chew through this story, as we live with it, as we realize that this story may have been centuries and centuries and centuries ago, this story is also today. This is today's news, today's headlines. This is on the streets in the United States of America. This is happening in Napa, California. The Abraham-Sarah Hagar struggle is with us still, and we struggle with it. We struggle as Hagars in the world because we are taking it on the chin. And we struggle as Abraham and Sarah's in the world because in our pride, we don't even see that we are part of the problem. And we need our vision changed. So in both cases, God, I'm asking you to break our hearts. They're already broken. For us Hagars, I ask that you break our thinking, that you shatter our vision and help us see in new ways. That while the loudest voices around us may be telling us awful things about who we are and our hopes and dreams get dashed, the whisper of your Spirit is just the opposite and invites us to restoration, strength, hope, the dream. and you will be with us no matter what comes. And that's the best we could ever hope for. And break our minds, God, people who look more like me, who struggle to even realize that there's a problem, and that some of our attitudes and the way that we talk about things and see things and deal with things may not reflect your Spirit at all. And while we may be able to get away with it, it doesn't make it right. So humble us. Warm our hearts. Help us see ourselves differently so that we might see everybody differently. And now mess with us. I ask you, God, by the power of your Spirit, to lodge one or two things in our minds right now, in our hearts. Things that need to stick with us. And things we need to take home with us today. That we would not leave here unchanged. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.